Hi everybody, I'm Chase Sanborn, and on this channel I share things I've learned in more than 40 years as a professional jazz trumpet player. I'm sorry, excuse me a second. Hey, yes, you.
What?
How much longer are you going to be making that noise?
You mean practicing the trumpet?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, excuse me. How much longer are you going to be practicing your trumpet?
Well, I need to do this at least 2 hours every day.
2 hours? Really?
Yep.
Imagine living with that. So that was the opening to one of my first videos on jazz improvisation, about 3 years ago. The topic is a recurring theme, that jazz improvisation can be easily and effectively equated to spoken language. When you look at it that way, you are already an expert at improvising. You do it every time you have a conversation. You're not working from a script, and you haven't memorized what you say. In fact, most of the time, you don't even know what you're going to say until you say it. You can walk up to a complete stranger and start a conversation by asking, "Where are you from?" or "What do you do for a living?" From there, the conversation can go anywhere, especially if we have something in common, as jazz musicians do. The thing that's required for this to happen is that we have a shared language, again, as jazz musicians do. Spoken language is comprised of vocabulary and grammar, which determines the meaning and the order and the function of various words. Jazz improvisation has these things too. You can think of the chords as individual words and groupings of chords or chord progressions like sentences. Sentences are combined to express a thought or tell a story or improvise a solo. When you're having a spoken conversation, there's generally some sort of topic that's being addressed at any given moment, whether that's sports or politics or the weather or what to eat for dinner. When jazz musicians embark on a musical conversation, that often begins by agreeing on which tune to play. That gives us certain parameters relating to melody, harmony, rhythm, and form. Within those parameters, each musician has a great deal of freedom to make up their own part. Although there may be a specific soloist at a given moment or somebody might be playing the composed melody, everybody is improvising, in that nobody tells the trumpet player exactly how to phrase the melody, although I do have some suggestions for that, starting by learning the words. Nobody tells the piano player which chord voicings to use or defines a specific pattern for the drummer. Jazz music offers a lot of freedom to the performers, but freedom that's born of knowing the rules is likely to produce a more coherent and relevant conversation, just as it is in spoken language. Now, for a lot of people, the ability to improvise is a mystery or a gift that some people are born with. How is it that we can step onto stage with no music and no rehearsal, and with only a few words, possibly even none, we can produce a complete performance? People wonder whether improvisation is comprised of memorized phrases or just licks that we string together. Now, in one way, you could say that that is true, just as it is when you're speaking. You're not making up new words or redefining the way they go together. The art is in using the familiar tools of language to express original thoughts. Another common question is whether jazz musicians think about the chords when they improvise. Well, I ask in return, do you think about the words when you talk? Clearly, you know the meanings of the words you use, and deep in the recesses of your mind is the knowledge that adjectives go before nouns. But you're not really thinking about that when you speak, and the reason is you are fluent in the language. When you're fluent, you don't have to think about the words or the order in which to use them. Those things flow naturally as you focus on the ideas that you want the words to convey. Now, the same is true for jazz. If we understand the basics of the language, and we know the tune, which could be equated to having some knowledge about the topic of a spoken conversation, then we don't have to consciously think about the harmony as defined by the chords, or the pulse as defined by the time signature, or the form as defined by the tune. We've internalized those things so that they exist on a subconscious level, so the conscious mind can get past the details to focus on a bigger picture. Now, I know this is a hard concept for people to grasp in the early stages, when everything seems overly complicated and confusing. But think about how you learned your first language, not by memorizing a dictionary and studying the rules of grammar, but by listening and imitating. That's the primary way that people learn to improvise, by listening and imitating. That's what you do when you transcribe solos, and I'll have a few videos that are specifically about that down the road. As a child learning to speak for the first time, your vocabulary was limited and your words were not very clear. But as you continued to listen and develop the motor skills to produce the sounds that you heard in your head, you became more articulate. By the time you were a few years old, you knew that it didn't make sense to say the dog big or the fast house. Not because you've been taught the rules of language, but because it sounds funny to say it that way. Now, a jazz musician knows that a 2 minor chord often precedes a 5 dominant chord, which often precedes a 1 major chord. But even if you know nothing about that, if you heard a tune in which this order was consistently mixed up, you'd know on some level that something sounds awry. You've been hearing these sounds all your life. Your ear understands them better than your brain might at this point. Music theory is simply a way to describe and communicate what are generally familiar sounds. And none of it will really make sense until you connect it to a sound. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense to start with the sound. Music that is learned by ear is always more impactful than music that is learned by eye. So if I was going to drop you on a desert island for the next 5 years with the assignment of learning to improvise, and I gave you your choice of a stack of records or a stack of books, take the records. Okay, they wouldn't be records anymore, but you get my point. If you do nothing else for the next 5 years but listen and imitate your favorite jazz musicians, you'll learn the language. If you do everything else but not that, well, I don't think we can be nearly as certain of the outcome. Still, for someone who wants to learn the jazz language, it's helpful, and at this point I would say it's essential, to understand the nuts and bolts of it. That's what the videos on this channel strive to do, to help you understand what's going on, both on an oral and an intellectual level. In other words, to teach you to speak jazz.